Hello and welcome back. We continue our lecture on the types of conduct the Equality Act prohibits. And last week we looked at direct discrimination, and today we will be looking at indirect discrimination. All right, so I'm going to share my screen now, so you can see my slide. Okay, so we will be looking at indirect discrimination. All right. Direct discrimination provision, is not enough to achieve the aims of the discrimination law, which is to stop a disadvantage caused to people because of a protected characteristic. Right. I'll demonstrate this with an example. So let's say, there is an advert on a job site and it says, manager wanted, women need not apply. Okay, this is a clear case of direct discrimination because they are excluding women from applying, thereby treating women less favorably than men. Remember, the direct discrimination provision, stops a person from being treated less favorably because of a protected characteristic. So this advert is directed at women and forbids them from applying. Okay, now let's suppose, the wording of the advert is changed to that. Manager wanted, applicants must be 6 feet tall. Now, can you see that this second example is not directed at anyone in particular? But when you analyze it closely, you will see that this can discriminate against women and people of a certain racial group. I mean, you may ask how. Okay, they are looking for a manager, and the manager has to be 6 feet tall. How many women can meet that requirement? Maybe not a lot. Okay, statistics or the data shows that the average height of a woman in the UK is 5 feet 3 inches tall, while the average height of a man is 5 feet 9 inches tall. So a woman is less likely than a man to meet that requirement. I mean, it does not mean that you will not find a woman who is 6 feet tall, but a lot of women will be excluded from applying. So this is what the indirect discrimination law tries to stop. Okay, so this indirect discrimination provision originated from the US case of Griggs and Duke Power. All right, so I have the case written out, okay, and I'll just read what I have. Okay, so Duke's power station was divided into 5 departments, and the labor department was the dirtiest and lowest paid out of the rest. A high school diploma and an intelligence test was needed to gain a promotion to the other 4 departments, and these requirements were not related to the job. There were 95 workers, 14 of whom were Black. They were all employed in the labor department. So they sued Duke Power. Statistics showed that 34% of whites completed a high school compared to 12% of Blacks. And then research showed that 58% of whites passed the intelligence test compared to 12% of Blacks. All right, so the Supreme Court found that Duke Power was liable. It said that if an employment practice which operates to exclude Black people cannot be shown to be related to the job performance, then the practice is prohibited. All right, so a burden is placed on the employer to show that any given requirement must have a manifest relationship to the employment in question. Okay, so that's the case of Dukes and Greeks against Duke Power. Now, from this case, we can see that the requirement to pass the test, before a promotion was not directed at anybody. Okay, it was something that was left open to everybody. Write the promotion test. If you pass it, then we will promote you. But more Black people were put at a disadvantage because of that requirement. Okay, so in indirect cases, 2 things are evident. All right, the first one, the claimant has to show that an apparent neutral practice has led to an adverse impact on a protected group. Okay, so for example, in this Duke's case, a high school diploma, was a condition of employment, and a larger proportion of whites completed high school than blacks. Okay, now let's not forget, that this case was around the time of racial segregation in America, where Black people were restricted from going to school. All right, so the second one, in indirect cases, is that the burden is on the employer to justify the practice by showing that it was necessary to achieve a goal. Okay, example from this case again is that the employer will have to show that that high school diploma was necessary to perform the job. So therefore, if an employer, for an employer not to be held liable, he has to justify that practice. Okay, so let's look at what we have, in our Equality Act of 2010. Okay, that's the provision on indirect discrimination, and this can be found in section 19, okay, which says that a person A, okay, discriminates against another B if A applies to B a provision, criterion, or practice which is discriminatory in relation to a relevant protected characteristics of B. Now, before I go further, to read out the rest of the provision, let's assume B is a woman, okay, and her name is Sarah. Okay, so this would help us, understand this better, so that I can explain as I go along. Okay, so it goes on. The second part goes on to say, for the purposes of subsection 1, a provision, criterion, or practice is discriminatory in relation to a relevant protected characteristics of B if A applies or would apply it to persons with whom B does not share the characteristic. Okay, so in other words, what he's saying there is that A applies the criteria to everybody. Okay, he applies it to everybody. So that is to Sarah and those that do not share Sarah's characteristics. That's men. Okay, the other one says, it puts or would put persons with whom B shares the characteristic at a particular disadvantage when compared with persons with whom B does not share it. All right, so in other words, that criteria puts the people that share Sarah's characteristics, so that is other women, at a disadvantage when you compare them to those that do not share it, that is men. Okay, then it puts or would put B at that disadvantage. So that means that the criterion actually puts Sarah at a disadvantage. And A cannot show it to be a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. In other words, A, which is the employer, cannot justify that that criterion is a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. Okay, so in other words, indirect discrimination, okay, just trying to summarize that provision. Indirect discrimination is when an employer has a provision, a criterion, or practice, which I call PCP, okay? So he has a PCP that puts a person with a protected characteristic at a disadvantage when compared to others that do not have the characteristic, all right? And the employer does not have any legitimate reason for having that PCP. Okay, so so just like we did in direct discrimination, I would want us to analyze some of the words used here. Okay, so we have provision, criterion, or practice. Okay, so which I said let's just call it PCP. Okay, so the PCP could be a requirement, which an employer is looking for from an employee to do the job. Okay, so it could be a strict requirement, or even just a mere preference, which employer asks for. So, for example, you may come across, some job adverts that will have a section. They'll have a section that they call essential criteria. And, in that section, they'll be, saying the things that they want an applicant must have before, they will be considered for the job. Okay. And then they also have a section that they call desirable criteria. Okay. So in that one, the applicant does not have to have it, but if they have it, that would be advantageous to them, because if all the applicants have all the essential criteria, and then some of them don't, and some do have the desirable criteria, then that may put them, above those that don't. Okay, so these sort of requirements, can be considered to be, a PCP. So you have some of them asking for things like, management experience, or things like, knowledge of the local area. Okay, so any of these things could count as a PCP that is applied to that particular job. Okay, so PCP could also cover an employer's subjective decision, which he made before choosing an applicant, to give them the job. So things like, deciding to give an applicant a job because they had good interpersonal skill. Okay, that is a subjective decision. Okay, so, and that can also count as a PCP. It is subjective because interpersonal skills cannot be measured. All right, because what I may consider as good interpersonal skill, another person may not see them as good. Okay, so therefore, subjective assessment made by an employer, can count as a PCP. Then it can also, PCP can also cover word of mouth recruitment or promotion. Okay, so this is where employers, they do not advertise jobs, but they may ask their managers to refer people for the job. Okay, so this has a tendency of creating an imbalance in the workforce, because the managers may refer their friends, to apply for that job. And of course, their friends may be people that share common characteristics with them. Okay, so that could count as a disadvantage to someone. Okay, then proving a particular disadvantage. All right, so the purpose of the indirect discrimination is to eliminate practices that have a disproportionate impact on people with a protected characteristic. All right, so, and again, those practices cannot be justified by the employer for any reason. All right, to establish a claim, it is sufficient to show that the PCP results in a particular disadvantage to those who share the characteristic and to the claimant. Okay, so they have to show that the PCP, causes a disadvantage to, so let's say the claimant is a woman, okay, and the people that share her characteristics are other women, then that PCP will result in a particular disadvantage to women and the person bringing the claim. It's not necessary to show why that PCP resulted in that disadvantage. Okay, they don't have to show that. Okay, but they can show a connection between the PCP and the disadvantage. Okay, so they don't have to show why the PCP has caused them the disadvantage, as long as they can show, okay, see, this PCP was what caused this, but not why it has caused this, caused it. So we have that case in ESOP against the home office. Okay, so the claimants, they allege that BME, so that's Black and minority ethnic groups above 35 years, were systematically less likely than non-BMEs and younger candidates to pass a core skill test for promotion within the home office. The claimants did not know why BMEs were failing that test. Okay, all they knew is that statistics showed that they were less likely to pass the test. Okay, but they didn't know why. The employment tribunal held that the claimants had to prove why they failed the test. But on appeal, the Supreme Court rejected, went up all the way to the Supreme Court. It rejected it and said that the law does not require that proof. The law does not say that they have to show reason why they have. All the law says is that there has to be a connection, okay, because they're not passing this test, that's why they're not getting a promotion, okay? And statistics show that a lot of them, or rather, they are less likely to pass the test, okay? So the law does not require proof of why, okay? What the law requires is, to show a connection between the PCP, and the disadvantage. Okay, right, so indirect discrimination requires that the claimant and some identifiable section of the workforce, even if it's a small part of them, must be shown to suffer a disadvantage. Okay, therefore, only one person cannot be put at a disadvantage. Okay, there has to be, at least a group, not just one person. The law does not require that the PCP should put every member of that group at a disadvantage, okay? It is sufficient if some members are put at that disadvantage. Then again, it does not, it is not necessary to use statistics to show that members of the group, have been put at that disadvantage. It is sufficient, okay, if some evidence can be produced, to show that a group, has been put at a disadvantage. It is open to the respondent, that's the employer, to show that a particular claimant was not put at a disadvantage. So a person may bring a claim saying, oh, okay, this PCP or this requirement has put women at a disadvantage, but it does not affect that particular claimant. Then the employer is entitled to show, look, okay, even though we have this PCP, it doesn't affect this person. Okay, so an employer is open to do that. Okay, then we look at choosing the pool. Okay, identifying the pool of disadvantage is one of the most difficult tasks in indirect discrimination claims. And when we talk about when we talk of the pool of comparison, it means the people in the same circumstances as the claimant, excluding the disputed criterion. Okay, so these people will be put in a pool, and then the court would compare the effect of that PCP to those with the protected characteristic as against the effect it has on those that do not have that protected characteristic. Okay, I have a case, a price. Okay, I haven't included. I'll add this later on. Price and Civil Service Commission, where Ms. Price, she married young, okay, and raised her children before trying to get back into the job market. All right, then she wanted to apply to the Civil Service Commission, but there was a rule which the Civil Service had, and the rules said that applicants to the Civil Service must be below 28 years old. All right, so this lady, at this time she was about 36 years at the time. All right, so she argued that this rule indirectly discriminated against women, because when many women in their 20s were having children and raising them, and that women would have more difficulty in complying with that rule than men would. So in choosing the pool, the civil service, what they were trying to say that the rule should consist the entire national workforce, but the tribunal said no. They rejected this, and they said that the pool that the tribunal considered consisted of only potential applicants for that job, both those that were over 28 and those that were under 28. So this enabled the tribunal to compare sort of like with like, and excluding the criteria. Okay, so in choosing the pool, so you can see section 23 there of the Equality Act. Okay, it says that there must be no material difference in the circumstances of the members of the group. Okay, there must be no material differences. So like should be compared with like, okay, and that should include those affected by the term. So this should include both people who can comply with that term and those who cannot comply, with the term. Okay, and the pool, must test the particular disadvantage complained of, by measuring the impact of that PCP on the claimant group, and then comparing it with the impact it has with others in the pool. That's others that don't have that protected characteristics that were put in that pool. Okay, in Somerset County Council and Secretary of State for Children against Pike, it was held that the appropriate pool for assessment for retired teachers who were in receipt of a pension but returned to work on a part-time basis expecting further pension, that the pool should include all retired teachers rather than all teachers. Okay, so it has to be people that the term will affect and not everybody that should be put in the pool. Okay, so those who do not have an advantage or disadvantage should not be brought into that pool. Okay, so when the court is trying to, compare the effect of this PCP or the impact it will have on the protected groups, okay, it has to be bringing those that will be affected by whatever term or PCP that the employer, has in place. The tribunal should consider choosing from a pool that is realistic and effective in testing the case that they have at hand. Okay. Okay. So the pool that the tribunal will choose will be dictated by the facts of the case. All right. So, for example, if let's say, for instance, the challenged practice is a dismissal procedure. Okay. So somebody is bringing a case, saying that the dismissal procedure, had a disadvantage on a group. Okay. So the pool may be the entire workforce. Okay, so it might be, so in that employment, all the people that work there to see how it impacts on the disadvantaged group. All right, but if the challenge practice is, say, for instance, in national legislation, then the pool may consist of the entire population. All right, so the PCP is challenged for its disproportionate impact on a group. Now, when we talk of disproportionate, we are talking about proportions. All right. Hence, it is better to compare proportions rather than numbers. All right. So if we compare the proportion of those who could comply with the term to, we will be comparing proportions of those who will comply with the term to the proportions of those who cannot comply with that term. In some instances, where the number of the protected group is low in that pool, using numbers to compare will result in fewer members of the group who are put at an advantage. Okay, so it's better, to use a proportion, to compare. All right, so I have that case, London Underground against Edwards. Okay, so London Underground, they were found to have sexually discriminated against Miss Edwards, who was a single mother. Okay, so they had a rota system, which she sort of fitted her childcare needs around it, and it worked fine for her. All right, then later on, they came up, London Underground came up with a new rota system, which she was unable to comply with. Okay. There were, these were male operators. So there were 20 female train operators and there were 2,023 male operators. All right. So the other 20 and all the men were able to, comply with that new rota system. All right. So in this case, the appropriate pool will be all train operators. All right. So if they had used numbers, it would have been, you would see that, it would have just been just her, one single person, out of about, if you add them all together, about 2,043 train operators that would not have complied. Okay, so it would be, so 2,043 operators would have complied against just one person. All right, but if we use proportions, you see that the comparison will now be between 100% male operators as against 95% female operators. Okay, so it's better to use proportions rather than numbers, because using numbers might make the number insignificant. All right, so the tribunal, okay, is entitled to use its discretion to take account of statistics in showing a percentage of the people, women who could comply, okay, in contrast to men. Okay, so the requirement, of using a pool is now relaxed. Okay, all the claimant needs to do now is to show that she or her group has been placed at a disadvantage when compared to the, other group. Okay, so if it's a woman, so she'll be showing that she and other women have been placed at a disadvantage when compared to men. And then in Ministry of Defense and the BIC, it was held that there was no universal law that states what the pool should be in a particular case. Okay, but that the tribunal should consider their position in respect of different pools that are available to them, and then choose the one that the tribunal thinks is realistic and effective for them to test the case that they have before them. Okay, then we look at the next term or phrase used. Okay, so puts or would put. All right, so let's consider the second part of that phrase. All right, would put. Okay, so this means it hasn't put them at a disadvantage yet, but it is likely to do so. So if a job advert says, using the case that we just looked at, you cannot apply if you are above 28 years, all right, it will put them at a disadvantage because it would stop people of that age from applying and having an opportunity from getting the job. Okay, therefore, if the contested term would deter a person and the people in their group from applying, then they could bring a claim. All right, then we have the next, so the first phrase that says put, okay, put at a disadvantage. So this requires that the challenged practice puts the claimant's group at a particular disadvantage. So this demands a connection between the challenged practice and the claimant's group. So this means that the claimant does not have a burden of proving why. Okay, it just puts you at a disadvantage, so they don't have to prove why the PCP has put them at a disadvantage. All they need to do is to show that there is a causative link between the PCP and the disadvantage. All right, so the court would then consider whether the impact of that practice falls disproportionately on a protected group. All right, so we have that case, O'Flynn and Chief Adjudication Officer. Okay, in this case, the ECJ, that's the European Court of Justice, held that a requirement that burials or cremations took place in the UK, in order for people to qualify for funeral expenses, was intrinsically liable to adversely affect migrant workers more than national workers. All right, so this would affect migrant workers disproportionately because they are more likely to want to bury their family members in their country of origin. Okay, so that would put them, at a disadvantage. The PCP, okay, I think I've said this again before, the PCP does not have to put every member of the group at a disadvantage. Okay, what is required is that the proportion of the group who could not comply is smaller than the proportion of the group who could comply. All right, so again, as I said earlier, the claimant does not have to explain why that PCP puts them at that disadvantage, okay? All they need to do is to show a causative link between the PCP and the disadvantage. We saw that earlier in ESOP and home office. Okay, so we look at the next one, which is objective justification. Okay, so once a claimant has established a prima facie case, the burden will shift to the defendant, that's the employer, okay, to objectively justify the PCP. Now remember, direct discrimination cannot be justified, all right, but indirect discrimination can be justified if the employer can show that the PCP was a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. All right, so the objective the employer was trying to achieve will be considered, to determine if measures he adopted were sufficiently important, to justify limiting somebody else's fundamental rights. And then the onus is on the employer, to show that the requirement was objectively justified, either for economic reasons or for administrative reasons. So it's the employer that would bring evidence to show, okay, look, this is why we're doing this, okay, to try to justify why they have, indirectly discriminated against somebody. Okay, so to consider whether it was justified, the tribunal should consider the employer's reasons, all right, to determine if their reason demonstrates a real need, and then how serious the adverse impact was, okay, and then whether that need outweighs the adverse impact. It is the duty of the tribunal to balance the adverse impact against the needs of the employer and then the aims that he is trying to achieve. The tribunal has to be satisfied that the requirement the employer is trying to put forward is real. Okay, so it's not just a made up reason to cover himself. All right, so whether a requirement is justified is a question of fact. Okay, it's a question of fact and not a question of law. So if a tribunal finds that a requirement is justified, it cannot be disturbed on appeal, okay, because it's a question of fact and not of law. Okay, yeah, so I have some examples here, I have some examples here to show, where some of these indirect discrimination was justified. All right, so we have part-time work. Okay, so it is established that less favorable treatment of part-time workers adversely affects women, who are more likely than men to work part-time. Okay, we will consider this in a bit more detail when we look at sex discrimination. All right, but part-time work, more women are more likely to work part-time than men. So less favorable treatment of part-time workers would require justification under the sex discrimination law. All right. So if an employer refuses a woman to switch, to part-time work, then he is likely to indirectly discriminate against women. Okay, unless he can justify it. Okay. So remember, even if the act or the PCP or the requirement, whatever it is, if it indirectly discriminates, I mean, it is still discrimination, all right? But once it's justified, then the employer will not be held liable, all right? So we have that case, Greater Glasgow Health Board against Carey. Okay, so the employer was able to justify denying a health visitor to switch from full-time work to part-time work, due to, they had administrative reasons for not allowing that, okay? So they were allowed to justify it. Then the next one, tests and qualifications. Okay, so using tests and educational qualifications, for employment decisions, such as promotion or redeployment, I mean, using those tests, they are objective, okay, because the employer does not want to do favoritism or anything. Okay, so let's do a test, to know who meets the criteria. Okay, it is an objective way of doing promotion or redeployment. All right. However, it can also be indirectly discriminatory. Okay, so we have already seen this in a sub case. It can also affect some groups due to their cultural or historical reasons, as we saw in the case of Greeks and Duke's power, okay, where the tests that were used for promotion affected Black people due to their history of racial segregation. Okay, so tests for promotion may favor those with long work history experience, all right, and then may disfavor others. Okay, so say for instance, women, due to childcare reasons, may work less, be less in employment in the labor market. Okay, so if they use tests, it will favor men who may not have had any reason to leave the employment market, while it would disfavor women. All right, so such tests must be justified as necessary for the job, and they must also correspond, with the job requirements. Employers are usually, advised to professionally validate their skills test. Okay, so if they do this, then it would improve their chances of justifying them, saying that they have had, professionals validate that test to find it not to be discriminatory against certain groups. But then we have physical health and safety reasons. All right, so it will be unlawful to exclude all women from a job, on the basis that a few of them, will meet the strength and stamina required in that job. In that case, the US case, Dothard and Rawlinson, the employer had height and weight restrictions, before an applicant will be considered for a job as a prison guard. Okay, so the respondent filed a lawsuit when she couldn't meet the requirements, because that requirement acted as a barrier to equal treatment of women. Okay, so they had a minimum requirement for height and weight. Okay, so and like I said earlier, men are taller than women. Okay, so that could restrict women, from applying for such jobs, and that actually restricted this woman, from applying for that job. So in that case, the employer failed to justify that the minimum height and weight restrictions were necessary for performing that job. Then we also had a case, a British case, Singh against the British Rail Engineering Limited. Okay, in that case, the employer introduced a policy that workers should wear what they called bump caps, when working under raised railway carriages. And this was found, there was a Sikh person working there, and Sikhs, they had to wear a turban, as part of their religion. Okay, so if he had to take off his turban to put on the bump caps, I mean, his religion required that he put that on. Okay, so this indirectly discriminated against them, okay, due to their religion, but this was held to be justified, for health and safety reasons, okay, because the employer was trying to protect the workers there. Okay, right, so an employer seeking to justify a discriminatory PCP cannot rely solely on considerations of cost, okay, but it can put cost into the balance, all right, together with other justifications if there are any other there, okay, but he can't just say, oh, it's cheaper for us to do this. That cannot be allowed, okay. He cannot justify it based on that, okay. There has to be other things, okay, so it could be, these health and safety reasons or administrative efficiency or things like that, okay, but not solely on cost. He can't rely on that. There are other justifications for, that can be put forth for a discriminatory PCP, which an employer can use. Okay, so I will leave that and we'll consider them when we look at our lecture on exemption. Okay, yeah, and that brings us to the end of indirect discrimination. That which is that a discriminatory PCP which an employer puts in place, okay, and it puts or discriminates against a protected group, and the employer does not have a legitimate reason for having it, okay. So that's indirect discrimination policy that's applied to everyone, okay, is applied to everybody equally, but a group that has a protected characteristic is affected, okay, and then it will be classed as indirect discrimination if the employer does not have a legitimate reason for having that, that PCP, okay, and I've already told you, okay, yeah, so indirect discrimination can be justified, whereas direct discrimination cannot be justified. Okay, so that's it. That's it for indirect discrimination. So next lecture, we will continue with the other types of discrimination. All right, so I'll see you soon.